London is an amazing city. I know London reasonably well, but when I stop and think, I realize I take so much of it for granted. Statues, monuments, and famous buildings all blend into a blur, and perhaps I don't give the place the respect it deserves. My name is Ian Currey, and this is Thinking Out Loud. Come on, let me tell you what I think. Most of us love to talk about where we live or where we're from. Now, I spent a good bit of my childhood in London, and since we moved around so much growing up, I always think of myself as being from London, since that's the only place from my childhood I really know. These days, I live in a place called Peachtree City, which is close enough to the world's busiest airport for me to get there in half an hour every day I'm working. And Peachtree City is newer than anything I can think of in London, and so really isn't interesting. Well, other than it has over 100 miles of golf cart track. Many who live here own a golf cart and use it to get around town, visit the lake, or go to the shops. Fun. But just like being from somewhere much more famous, do you think I could find a recent picture of a golf cart? No, of course not. We take them so much for granted that we don't bother taking pictures. We just know they will always be there. Working for an airline means that I travel a great deal and can often choose the routes I fly. London, of course, is high on my list of places to go. Now, this past summer, I managed to visit, I think, 9 times in the space of 2 months. And while that's a lovely thing to do if you happen to like flying, our layovers are typically just 24 hours, so planning what to do and where to go is essential. My interest in railways, and especially the London Underground, means that I've plenty of pictures of trains. But what about those things that are more important? What about places people who don't know the city would take pictures of? Growing up in the city meant we took for granted things that others would find strange. World War II bomb sites, for example. My grandparents lived on this street, but back then the trees weren't there. Well, most of them weren't, at least. In the back garden of Nana's house was a big dip, a bomb crater, and an Anderson shelter. And that's somewhere we were told, don't go there, you're not allowed there. But we did anyway. One of these days I'll have to make a video about this particular street. It's very interesting and a lot of things happened here. Not all so good. It's certainly easy to walk past things that would be fascinating if I just took a moment to realize they were there. In a previous video I mentioned Bayswater, for example, a river that has been largely forgotten. Another example, long ago I visited a ship moored in the East India Dock. Now, being curious and wondering if it really was as dangerous an area as I remembered it being, I had a little wander down memory lane, and despite knowing it might have changed, it had, there wasn't a single thing other than the dock wall to remind me of my childhood adventure. Pictures are all in my mind. No smartphones with amazing cameras back then. This week too, I had a look through some old photos of London. I found this one of an engineering train moving slowly into a station with workers aboard that looked like they'd been up all night. They had. I asked them. Now, although the picture was only taken 10 years ago, things have changed a great deal since then. Railway friends were quick to point out that there Wouldn't be riding up front these days like that, no. Health and safety. So much of London is a mishmash of buildings that have been made fit for purpose in so many strange ways, and things that change very quickly. These metal things on the walls of the houses around where Nana used to live, I must have walked past hundreds of times without a second thought. Those are there because of bomb damage that destroyed a house that was once beside this one. There are long iron rods that go all the way through the house with these metal plates on each end to stop the walls bulging now that the neighbouring house is gone and not helping to keep them standing up straight. Elsewhere, new bricks show where parts of buildings have been repaired and new buildings sit where old ones once stood. All this is just a part of London being London with all of its recent history. Dig further and you'd find fascinating structures and systems going back beyond medieval times. I really must take the time to show you around my city some more sometime. The famous London Underground even, while relatively new at under 200 years old, hides a great deal of history. The whole reason for the central sections of the Underground being built in the first place, a Victorian, not in my backyard attitude to trains in general, is fascinating. Well, to me at least. Some of the further away parts of the rail system would deliberately run into places that had no houses, with the intention of luring developers onto land owned by the railway owners. No more protests about building a railway close to houses. The railway was now in place first. Palaces, pubs, parades and famous places are all part of the London I know. So why the lack of accurate facts about things I know? I've no idea, without looking, for instance, when the East India Dock actually closed. I know it did, but why don't I have a better understanding of why and when? What about parts of the underground system that I love so much? I knew the Victoria Line was designed and built to be automatically run and it had opened in 1968. I remember that. But why wasn't the Jubilee Line that opened more than a decade later only able to use the same automatic train operation as recently as 2011? History. Just about every tiny detail of London hides history. 10 Downing Street. You really can't see much of it with all of the security these days. Well, other than the back of the house from Horse Guards Parade. But if you could, why is it painted black? Growing up it certainly looked black, but that was soot from the coal fires we had back then. Now, once it was cleaned up in the 60s, the bricks looked yellow, and yellow isn't a colour for a Prime Minister. So after cleaning it, they promptly painted it black again. Silly. These quirks, though, are what makes London, London. Sadly, as we take things for granted, they can disappear forever without us really knowing what we've lost, or even if we've lost. If we ask people whose statues are of, or what's significant about a particular building, we may get no answer, or a made-up answer that has no resemblance to truth. By taking things for granted, soon they become unimportant and forgotten. It isn't long before we have to put up signs to remind people of what is right under their noses. So much of London's history revolves around the interaction between the church and society, but God has for so many been either taken for granted, or just like anywhere else, or worse yet, forgotten altogether. Sometimes things that shape us, are there in plain sight for us to rediscover. They know the truth about God because He's made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they became utter fools. The famous Palace of Westminster, where the Houses of Parliament sit alongside the River Thames on one side and Westminster Abbey on the other, demonstrates this exactly. If we collectively forget what we know, especially with such a depth of knowledge, hard life lessons will be scheduled to be retaken. Claiming to be wise, they became, instead, utter fools. While times change and things move on, and I for one am glad we no longer have smoke-filled streets and sooty buildings, losing my reliance on God, especially as I navigate an exciting modern world, would be tragic. When we get together, I want to encourage you in your faith, but I also want to be encouraged by yours. Personal faith, not a reliance on cultural traditions, even if based on faith, is essential. Losing that wonder of all that God is and does is like forgetting that London is home and not just a collection of old buildings. Until next time, goodbye.